Welcome to the Beacon Hill Fellowship. It's great to see you this morning. I hope everyone had a good week. I hope everyone's staying cool now that summer season has officially started. And I'd like to welcome our visitors, those of you who are guests visiting with us, whether you're here or watching online. Glad you chose to take some time out of your day to worship with us. Well, Tim and Regina are out away this weekend on a well-deserved vacation. But we are fortunate enough here at the Beacon Hill Fellowship to have people in our congregation who can step up and are ready and willing to speak in his absence and do other things. And today we're going to hear from Dr. Berney a little bit later in the service. We're excited about that. But as we always do when we start out our services, we always start with an ethos statement. And we like to say our ethos statement because it reflects a lot of things about who we are. We have values that it talks about, but it also talks about how we want to be as a community of faith as we go out into the world and how we see each other. So if you can join me in reading our ethos statement together. Married, divorced, or single here. It's one family that mingles here. Conservative or liberal here. We've all got to give a little here. Big or small here. There's room for us all here. Doubt and believe here. We all can receive here. LGBTQ and straight here. There's no hate here. Non-binary, woman and man here. Everyone can here. Whatever your race here, for all of us grace here. An imitation of the remarkable love Almighty God has for each of us and all of us. Let us live and love without labels.
May the peace of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Lord, we are grateful to be gathered together today to worship your holy name. We offer our worship and adoration to you, for you are worthy to be praised. We lift our voices together to offer you all that you are due. Thank you for bringing us together today to worship in this place. Amen.
Our scripture this morning from the New Testament, Matthew 22, 34 through 40, from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, the greatest commandment. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked this question of him to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the laws of the prophets. Thanks be to God, it is written.
Well, good morning. I feel like I've been up here a lot lately, and so it's great to be up to talk to you guys again today. That was a scripture we've heard the last several weeks, and I know Pastor Tim has been talking about that a lot as we're going through Pride Month and talking about lots of concerns and issues and topics related to Pride Week and Pride Month. And so I'm going to continue that a little bit today. He asked me to come up and talk a little bit about how we should respond, or especially in particular how parents might respond to, if their child comes out and talks about either being gay or lesbian or trans or any of the various presentations of gender identity or sexual orientation. And so I'm going to talk about that some today, with a little bit of the disclaimer that, I am a cisgender white male up here talking about issues that I haven't personally lived. Now, as a psychologist, I get to talk to kids and families all the time about some of these kinds of issues and concerns, and so I look forward to sharing with you what I've experienced and what I talk to kids and families about, and kind of go through some of those things with you. As we go through, we've done this over the last couple of weeks. if you have questions, please, raise your hand. I'm happy to answer questions as we're going through things. But we'll kind of see how all that goes. I'm going to start with a little bit of just some contextual things, because there's a lot of talk about these kinds of issues and concerns and topics. And one of those things that we're talking about a lot, or that's been in the news a lot, is just how many people have come out as LGBTQ, and where that is. And I don't know if many of you look at statistics like that or not, but it's very interesting, because if you ask most people what percentage of folks in the United States would identify as LGBTQ or somewhere on that spectrum, interestingly, people say somewhere around 20 to 24% or so. Now, it seems like a lot, especially when you think about our largest minority demographic, like Hispanics, only make up about 19% of the population. So a lot of people think that there's a huge number of people who would identify on the LGBTQ within that spectrum, and really the actual numbers is more like 7%. Now, it's a significant increase from what it used to be. Just a few years ago, it was only about 4 or 5%, but now it's about 7%, the most recent statistics that we can find. So it is increasing, but not necessarily quite as much as people seem to think. And I think a lot of the talk about 20 to 24% or so, I think that's more some of that, well, we'll just call it fear-mongering and things that happen to make it where, the schools are making these things happen and all of that, but we'll get to that a little bit as we're going. I think it's important to talk about the reason that more people seem to be coming out, and part of that is just there's more awareness. Whenever you look at popular media or you look at social media, there is lots of information out there about all of these topics. And I think that the more that things are out there, and my second point there is acceptance, the more that these kinds of topics are out there and people are talking about them and people seem to be more accepting of them, the more that's happening, the more people are going to be comfortable talking about their own experiences. And so as we have more acceptance, as kids, especially and teenagers, see examples of how they feel depicted on movie and TV screens, or as they hear people talk about them on social media and things like that, they're going to be more likely and more comfortable coming out and talking about it for themselves. And so that has certainly contributed to, in a great way, to the increase in prevalence. Now, when we think about why people come out, or we have to think about sort of that other context of what's going on in their lives. Like, when is it most likely that someone would express some of these thoughts or feelings or understandings of themselves? And it's important to say that there's a great variability. There is a lot of differences in things that contribute to when somebody may come out. I've had a chance to work with kids and adults, and I've had kids as young as 5 or 6 years old that didn't talk about it from the perspective of sexual orientation or really even gender identity, other than she was just adamant that she was a boy. And if her mom tried to let her hair grow out, she would cut it herself. And if mom tried to, get her a dress or something like that, she would sneak in and she would put on her twin brother's clothes. And so she was adamant that she was a boy from very early ages, before she really even knew, I would assume, before she even really knew what that meant. And so when kids come out is going to vary on a lot of things. There was this interesting study in 2017, and the link is in the bottom there, though I don't know that you can see it. And this study really looked at some interesting things. And I really like these kind of studies because what they do is they look at where someone is now as a teenager or as an adult, and then they go back and they have somebody who really didn't know anything about this person look at behaviors that were either described or on video or something from when they were little. And in this particular study, they had, it was a longitudinal study, so they had parents describing their kids in a lot of details at different points in their life. And when they look back, they found that there was a description of the parents, in particular the mom's description of the children's behavior that pretty well correlated with their sexual identity, sexual orientation at 15 years old, based upon their behavior when they were just 3.5 years old. So 3.5-year-olds were playing in non-gender specific behaviors. So boys were playing with more girl-type, what we traditionally consider girl-type toys and behaviors at 3.5. And those boys tended to identify as being either gay or trans by the time that they were 15 years old. Now, it's not really predictive because I can certainly remember my son walking around wearing his sister's high-heel plastic shoes when he was a little kid, and he's cisgender and does not identify in any way related to LGBTQ, but there is a relationship between some of these things that is consistent over the lifespan, and that's going to be important in just a second. But when we identify or we talk to people as adults, or in particular college, what we find is that almost half of them knew in high school that they were gay or lesbian or transgender. Just over 20% knew by the time when they were in middle school, and a good percentage, about 17 or so percent, knew when they were in elementary school. So people have known, many individuals know for most of their life that they, I think a phrase that's often used is that they're different. They may not fully recognize what it means until later, but they recognize some of those tendencies early in their life, but they may not talk about it until much later. Interestingly, this is just an interesting thing that I found as I was researching some of this, people are much more likely to come out to their family and to their friends and loved ones about their sexual orientation more so than they are about their gender identity. And that's pretty interesting, and I think it's very related to a lot of the political stuff going on right now. Not to mention that we've talked about sexual orientation differences much longer than we've talked about transgender types of issues, and so I think that that's going to change as time passes. But when we think about why kids come out, and I know I'm going a little bit fast, but I'm trying to be mindful of time, because there's a lot that we can talk about with these things. But when we think about why kids come out, one of the big reasons that they do so is because they want to feel safe. When kids feel safe, they tend to come out earlier than when they don't feel safe. Hopefully that makes sense. But kids want to feel safe. They want to feel accepted. They want to feel as though there are people who will support them and be there for them and to help them as they're going through some of these things. And when you think about especially younger kids, oftentimes they're confused. They don't know what's going on. And I don't necessarily mean that they're confused about what their gender identity or their sexual orientation is. They're just confused as to what all that means, because everybody talks about them this way, but they feel this way, and that creates a little bit of distress sometimes and confusion for them. But what we know is that, especially at the younger ages, it is almost never related to sex. They almost never identify the way that they identify because they're interested in having sex. It's just not for those reasons. It has to do with how they feel. It has to do with what they are attracted to or drawn to, but it's not about sex specifically. It's about just these feelings, sometimes romantic feelings, but it's about those things as opposed to, we often sort of misassociate these things with sex specifically, and it's just not the case. Mental health is a big reason why people, and especially young people, come out. There's this thing called gender dysphoria, and we think about it specifically with gender identity. But dysphoria is something, a general term that means it's almost like a malaise. It's a discomfort, a distress, sometimes depression, but just serious negative emotions and feelings that come about associated with something. And so gender dysphoria you have those feelings because of your identified gender or some of those discrepancies. But you experience the same dysphoria related to sexual orientation or lots of other things in life. But it's not just because of that. I had an opportunity recently to meet a fellow who, I said fellow, but he identifies now as a woman. And she has absolutely never experienced dysphoria. She was very specific about how that was never an issue for her. She just has always known that she was in the wrong body, but she has never really experienced any of that distress that we typically associate with gender identity differences. So it's not always dysphoria, but dysphoria can be a big problem. One of the big concerns is suicidal risk, though. We know that individuals in the LGBTQ community, especially young kids and teenagers, are at seriously elevated risks for suicidal ideation and suicidal types of behaviors. As you can see here, the risk is about 46% in the LGBTQ community, whereas it's only about 22, I say only, it's still high, 22% or so in overall adolescents. Now, I think that 22% statistic is really important too, because that 22% is all teenagers, all youth, which means that includes LGBTQ individuals, youth. So when you take and you separate based upon sexual orientation, individuals who identify as lesbian or gay or bisexual, and then compare them to those who only identify specifically as heterosexual, there's about 3 times the risk of suicidal ideation in the lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals as compared to those who are heterosexual. So we know that there is a profound difference between those who are identifying in this way versus those who are cisgender heterosexual. And the last point here on why kids come out and why youth come out in particular is it's all part of identity development. The adolescent years is so important when it comes to identity. That is the time when we are working really hard to figure out who we are. I often tell parents, I said, this is a time when, pickup trucks come in the parking lot and they have, beef, it's what's for dinner on their front tag and everything, and then their teenager comes in and claims that they're vegan. And, they're doing everything they can to be different than their parent, but that's part of them figuring out who they are. Sometimes being able to express yourself is an important way to be able to identify yourself, to be able to demonstrate who you are and what you believe in and what you feel. If you could just take a moment and imagine what it would be like to have all of your feelings and all of the thoughts and emotions that you have, but feel as though you can't tell them to anyone. That would be really restrictive, really harmful to our mental health and to our psyche and to the way that we feel about ourselves and about our safety in our world. So, as I'm about to get to some ideas and strategies for how parents and how individuals should respond in these kinds of situations, I want to mention quickly about why it's important that we think about how we respond. Some of the research, I'll talk about this CAS review that came out not long ago, and many of you may have heard that there was our governor signed a law talking about, you can't do any gender-affirming care in Florida as it relates to youth, and that was recently overturned by a federal judge, which we were very excited about. But part of that, if you saw Governor DeSantis' response to that, he said, he mentions the UK and Europe, and that he's going to look to them, and he's going to work, kind of follow some of their guidelines and things as we're looking to what we're going to do and how we're going to address what he's going to do as far as looking for an appeal. And what he's referring to there is this huge report that came out not long ago called the Cass Review. And it's a physician reviewed all of the literature related to some of these issues, and she issued a summary. It was about 400 pages or so. I haven't read it, but I read some of it. Not all of it. It's a lot. But one of the things that they talk about, and I think one of the things that's really put out there, is that when kids come out, and there's some research to suggest that the younger the kid is when they come out, the more risk they have for suicidal ideation at some point in their life. That younger kids tend to experience some of that bullying, especially trans children who sort of start to socially transition. So they start wanting to use different pronouns and different name and different clothing and things like that, that they really experience a lot of suicidal ideation and stuff. However, what I think the Cass report review kind of fell short of, and what a lot of other people fall short of, is that what that same research says is that if you take out the effects of bullying, if you control for that, they all do better, actually. And so we have to do a better job of recognizing the risk and the consequences of bullying. And so when we think about why our response is so important, the first thing is that we have to make sure that kids feel that they're supported and that they're loved, and we have to avoid those tendencies to bully. I recently saw a girl who came out to her family, and she was, just living her life with Dad and things like that, and she says that Dad would make jokes every once in a while, and it wasn't like they were really bad jokes or anything like that, but there were little things that he would say that really just got to her. Like he would say things like, well, we're the same, we both like girls. That's not exactly what she wants to hear, because, she's in middle school, and so she doesn't really want to think about Dad that way. But also, that's not as supportive as you might think that it would be. That's like sort of minimizing it and not letting her really express her true self as an individual, as a person who is going through some of these experiences in life. So we have to really think about the effects of bullying and what happens at school, especially, because if you don't work in the schools, you don't really know how awful that can be for a lot of these kids. Interestingly, what the research says is that when a child comes out, regardless of whether it's gender orientation or sexual orientation, when they have a supportive parent, when they feel as though their parent or caregiver is very supportive of them, and oftentimes that means, using the correct pronouns and at least trying to use your chosen names and things like that. When they have a supportive family member, their risk of suicide drops by nearly half. So if you think back to that statistic I showed you a minute ago, where about 46% for LGBTQ and 22% for the rest of the population, it takes it about down to what is typical for their age. That's huge. Just by having a supportive parent, and that's not even taking into consideration anyone else, but just having a supportive parent or caregiver. If they have a supportive community, it takes it down even more. Kids who talk about having a supportive and nurturing school environment or friend group, extended family members, when they have those supports and structures around them, their risks for suicide and some of those major problems significantly decrease. And so, again, all the more reason that we need to be supportive and think about this with kids. So, how should we respond? The first thing we have to think about is, we love our kids. And it breaks your heart when you see a kid who had a great relationship, perhaps, with their parents, and then they come out, and then all of a sudden their parents are just shun them and tell them that they're wrong and tell them they don't have any idea what they're talking about and tell them that, how do you know what you like? You've never even dated before. And, all those things that parents say. we have to approach it with unconditional. You still love your child. You still care about your child. You still want the best for them. And you have to have that support and make sure that they know that you care about them and that you appreciate them coming to you and sharing with you and talking with you and feeling safe enough to give you that information and to tell you that. The next thing is, man, we got to do a better job of listening. You know, we do great talking as parents, but we don't do very well at listening. We need to listen more to hear what their experience is, to hear what they're going through. Sometimes I'll have families in my office, and when you can finally get the teenager to start talking, they say all kinds of things. Sometimes they say very insightful, amazing things. You're like, wow, you're only 15 and you said that. That's awesome. But then, if you're not careful, the parent immediately goes off somewhere else. And it's like, hold on, pause just for a minute. Did you hear what he just said? Because that was so insightful, that was so meaningful, and there was so much information in that one thing that he said. We have to do a better job of listening. They're going to tell you all kinds of things. They're going to tell you just about everything you want to know if you just pause long enough to hear them and to really listen and make sure that they know that they're safe in sharing that stuff with you. We got to show support. At Pride the other week, we saw that people are going around with shirts on that say, I support my gay son and all those kinds of things. That's awesome. Those are very overt ways, right, of supporting a child or a loved one that identifies based upon their sexual orientation and gender identity. Those are great ways, and those are very powerful and important ways. Having the equality sign, the equal sign on the back of your car, and all those kind of things. Those are great things to do. We have to think about the subtle things too, like that dad I was talking about a few minutes ago that makes those little comments, and it's like, those are very subtle jabs, little subtle hits and knocks that can negatively affect someone. We have to do more of those on a positive way. Identifying and talking about, programs or, characters in shows that are either are express themselves in ways similar to your child, or that you just recognize, hey, that was a really cool character in that movie. Not to be fake and not to just say, hey, I'm trying to relate to you, kid. What's going on? But just in a natural way, just like we would with anybody else. We have those conversations about other people and about other characters and things like that. We need to do that with our kids as well, but to let them know that we recognize what their life is and what's going on around them. And then finally, learn the terms. What I mean by that is, there are, I don't know if any of you have ever looked, but you can go to PFLAG in different places online, and you can see the list continues to grow of different ways to identify either your gender or your sexual orientation. There's lots of words out there for lots of different things, because what we're recognizing now is there's more and more nuance to everything. And what we would typically, based upon, what life was like 40 or 50 years ago, we think about it this way. Well, that can be actually broken down into 7 or 8 or 50 different things. And so, and kids today are very adept at doing that. I don't know what makes them in particularly adept to doing that, but they are. And they will do that and break it apart in very specific ways. And so, again, I'll have folks come into my office, and we'll be talking, and they say words, and it's like, I've got to make a note about that word. I don't even know what that one means. But I'll make a note of it, and just so that I can learn and try to understand what their experience is, because I feel like it's important when I'm working with someone to know that, just as it's important if it's a loved one. But what I mean also, though, by learning the terms is doing the best we can at using their preferred gender, using their preferred pronouns, using their preferred name. Some parents are so against it. I have referred to you as a boy for 15 years, and now you want me to say she, call you a she or a her. It's hard. Sure, it's hard, and you're going to make mistakes, but you have to keep asking and working and trying, but learn that the importance of that, the importance of being consistent with them. Most of the time, my experience is, most of the time, they're very forgiving. You know, they can recognize, anybody going through this can recognize that you're trying, but you have to keep trying and not get frustrated and not get angry or anything like that. Now, I'm going to wrap up with this particular point because I think that this is, well, when the child leaves and I'm just talking with the parent, this is the big thing that the parents talk about, right? Well, what if this is just a phase? What if they're just trying to figure something out and they're just going through a phase? The reality is that this is a really tricky thing to deal with because who knows? We won't know until much later. But we got to respond initially in a healthy way because a lot of times the reason that we think that it's just a phase is because we are differentiating between what we want and who they are. Oftentimes those are two very different things. One of the things Dr. Marshall, who's been up here with me, and we work with a lot of families, and we do presentations about this, and we emphasize the point of raising the child that you have, not the child that you thought you were going to have, or the child that you wanted. This is another example of that. You have to interact and think about your child based upon who your child is, not who you wanted them to be, or not what you would ideally like for them to be. So you have to differentiate that. The other thing is that if a parent treats this as just a phase and they say, oh, this is just a phase, you don't know, you'll get through this. There are some kids, and many of you may know kids like this, who will go even farther down that line just to spite you. Just because you, oh yeah? You don't think so? And they'll go even farther. And that certainly isn't the majority of the cases, but we see that in just about every other area. You know, if you tell a kid that, you know, they can't do something or they shouldn't do something or they don't really like something, they're gonna prove you wrong. Whether it's true or not, they're gonna do it. I've had this one kid that I've worked with. Honestly, I was thinking about it not long ago. I've worked with him for almost 20 years. So I started with him when he was in early elementary school, and he recently, or a couple years ago, graduated high school. And he came out a few years ago, and his mom and stepdad really had a rough time with it. Mom was accepting of him, but refused to use his pronouns and refused to use his chosen name. And they really have battled serious battles for about 3 years. And all the while, I'm encouraging Mom, and who usually is very easy to work with her. Usually that works out okay, but it was tough. But she finally got to the point where she's like, I'm not gonna say anything else about it. She's just going to deal with it. And so recently I heard from them, and she said, you won't believe what happened the other day. I used the wrong pronoun, and I apologized. I said, sorry, I used the wrong pronoun. And she changed it, and his response was, that's all right. I'm not even sure what's going on with that anymore anyways. It was almost as though as soon as she backed off and she stopped opposing it so much, he was able to recognize and realize a little bit more about who he is. Instead of digging his feet in, which we tend to do anytime somebody tells us we're wrong about something, instead of digging his heels in, he's kind of lifting up a little bit. Now, I don't know what his true gender identity is or his true sexual orientation is. That's something that he's going to figure out over time, and hopefully I'll get to be there with him as he's working through it. But we got to be careful that we're not pushing our kids one way or another, either to defy us and to try to go even farther that way, or the opposite is to get back in the closet and close the door even tighter and try to live a life that's not true to them. So you have to find that balance between the two. We also have to avoid that myth of I should have known, I should have seen it, I should have had some idea that he was this way, or that he felt that way, or whatever. We don't know. You don't. As I said earlier, I can remember times when my son was wearing my daughter had one of those tall, like Barbie things, with the dress and the plastic shoes and stuff, and I would often see my son coming out wearing Barbie's outfit. It was fine. But what was really fun was when he would wear that and then go outside and play football. It's fine. He's fortunate that we only have a few pictures of that. But we don't use it against him in any way. But we don't necessarily know. We might look at some of these things and think, oh, maybe this is what this means, or maybe that's what that means. There's not necessarily a direct correlation. Sometimes there's patterns that we can see, but there's not usually a direct correlation. But it is important to say that most of the time, it's not just a phase. The research statistics show that the vast majority of people that identify as either a sexual orientation or a gender identity, most of the time, it holds. In fact, one of the things that came out in that CAS report was that they were really going up against gender-affirming hormone in medical treatments. And I think that's one of the things DeSantis was talking about when he referred to the UK, because they've put a block and a hold on using any gender-affirming treatments, whether it's puberty blockers or just hormones for gender transitioning. A hold on that until I think November or September or something like that. They're not allowing any physicians to use it. Even physicians who need to use it for other things, like non-gender affirming reasons. But what the research says is that most of the time, it's not just a phase. The vast majority, about 93% of people who start sort of a medical approach to gender support or gender affirming care, about 93% remain that identified gender for the rest of their life. A very, very small percentage of those who start that process then later on go back and say, okay, well, maybe not, maybe I'm, my birth identified gender. So it's really not true that people who make some of these claims are just saying it because they are wanting attention or something like that. There are some of those who do that, but the vast majority are not doing that. And we don't need to be careful about that tendency to sort of jump on that bandwagon of, well, it's just a phase, he'll get through it and he'll be fine. She'll figure out what's going on later on, and she'll change her mind about this. I don't know, I can't think of a time when I ever decided that I was heterosexual. I never thought of a time, cannot think of any time in my life when I decided that I was a male. We are who we are, and kids are figuring out who they are. And it's wonderful that we're living in a time when there's more information about this so that they can express themselves about this, as opposed to having to live lies and live a life that's not who they are just to make everybody else around them comfortable and feel safe for themselves. So when we, instead of thinking, okay, this is just a phase, this is just them experimenting, we need to have, again, that sort of flexible support. They're going to come to you. Those of you who work in the school, I remember when I was there, you'd have a kid come to you and they would say, oh, I would prefer to be identified with this name. And then like 2 weeks later, well, how about this name? Or how about, this week I'm, this gender, then they'll change it. I do my best to keep up with that. But you have to be flexible. You have to adapt because they're just figuring out who they are. And it's just a process. We don't do a very good job of letting that happen in schools anymore, in part because of things going on politically. But we have to remain flexible and remain supportive and just, I'm always hesitant when it comes to, when I see a 13-year-old who says that they want to go, they need a letter from me to be able to go on hormone treatment for gender transitioning. Well, we're going to go through a process. All of the medical organizations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, all of them have recommended procedures that you should follow if a person is interested in or wants to transition their gender. Just follow those guidelines, and everything will be figured out. Because usually that includes a year or sometimes 2 years of social transitioning, where you live as the identified gender with the clothing and with the name and the pronouns and everything. You do all of that before you do any medical things. So there's a process for all of this. Sexual orientation is a whole other thing. If a 12-year-old comes to me and starts talking about their sexual orientation, I'm going to be supportive, because I also know that there's not many 12-year-olds who are going out on dates and going to be alone with some person going, hopefully, doing any of those things that's going to really cause a lot of damage or a lot of problems or a lot of concern. If there are, it wouldn't matter if they were heterosexual, right? If a 12-year-old is going out on dates, that may be a problem no matter what. So deal with the issue, not with the orientation or anything like that. Here's a few resources. I know Pastor Tim has mentioned PFLAG. We have PFLAG meets here. But there's also the Trevor Project, if you haven't heard of them. A lot of the statistics that I presented comes from there. They do huge surveys every year, talking about 22 to 28,000 respondents for their research. It's really good stuff. And then here in town, of course, we have the Rose Dynasty Center, which is great because they offer medical and mental health support for the community, and it's just great stuff. So I think that's all that I have. I don't know what my time is like, but any questions or anything from anybody? Well, you guys were remarkably quiet. It's not like teaching middle schoolers in any way, so I appreciate that. But that is all I have. And so if you have any questions, feel free to come up to me afterwards, and I'm happy to do what I can.
It's that time in the service where we get to participate by returning tithes and offerings. As the offertory is played, I would remind you that opportunities for discipleship will scroll on the screen. So you might want to make a mental note of anything that's interesting or pertinent to you. We are thrilled to have Terry back, and Terry and Bill are going to pass the plate, and Terry's going to say the offertory prayer. But before he does, I just want to thank you on behalf of the entire stewardship team for adhering to pledges that were made. So far, we're having a fairly good summer, so thank you in advance.
Okay.
Terry.
All right. Normally, Tim does a blessing for the offering, and I'm not clergy, so I got help. I got supplemental liturgic resource number 1 here. And it says to read this introduction before you do the offering. With gladness, let us present the offerings of our life and labor to the Lord. And then it wants you to read a Bible verse, and it's Matthew 6:19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So, if you love this church, as I do, you'll do the best to support it. And now we'll take up the offering.
so as we do, we're going to stand and sing the benediction. And I noticed from the first time we did this hymn, this seemed to be, it really kind of touched everybody's heart. So we're going to leave it the benediction for the next month or so. The Church of Christ cannot be bound.